the problem that is before us as beings created by God becomes evident, I think, when we start talking about the flood and when we talk about the Old Testament and how we got to the place that we are now. And if you have your Bibles, I would like to encourage you to open it up in the very beginning in the Old Testament. We're going to look at the books of the law, which are the first 5 books in the Old Testament: Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy. We'll see how far we get today. I don't really know. I've never done anything like this, honestly, so I'm not sure how long it'll take. So we'll just go as long as we can, and then we'll pause and pick it up next time. Another way to describe these books is the Torah. If you've heard that, it's a Jewish or Hebrew phrase. And it is the books of the law written by Moses that were taken from oral tradition. And the word Genesis actually literally means birth. And so there is a logic to these books being at the beginning section of the Old Testament. But today I want us to just take a look at it as a whole and begin to think of it in terms of genre. You know, when I pick up a book to read, I tend to think of it in a chronology. You know, like I'm going to start at the beginning of something, I'm going to read through, and then I'm going to end. And the Old Testament is not really like that. I mean, there is some sense of that because you begin in Genesis at the beginning of the creation of everything, and you end in the period just before, kind of the silent period before Christ. So there is in that sense, but really the Old Testament is divided by genre. It's divided by genre. And there are, in fact, if you have that slide, guys, put up that little chart that says the books of the Bible, and it has kind of categories. Yeah, I know it's kind of hard to read out there, and I'll try to describe some things if you're like me and your eyesight's not quite 20/20 anymore. But you can kind of see that there are 5 sections that really make up the Old Testament. And I think understanding the type of literature that you're reading is valuable because it helps us understand the intent of the author, the intent of the Spirit of God as He speaks to us. And then as we begin to take it in, apply it to our lives, use it as a powerful source. And in fact, the Bible describes itself as a double-edged sword, which is as a weapon of war, an offensive weapon, a powerful weapon at this particular time. It'd be kind of like a nuclear bomb or something pretty powerful that we might think of as a weapon of war, a weapon of power. And so as we look at these things, I think we have to take them categorically. And so let's continue on talking about the books and the law. When we watch the video clip, and I'm sure that probably most of you are familiar with those stories that are there, we see that God created everything good. He created, the oceans and the land and people and all these good things. But a dilemma arose. And it's really the dilemma that exists today, and that is our freedom of choice ultimately leads us to choose to sin, to rebel, to harm ourselves, to harm others, to take things that are good and great and destroy them and cause pain and suffering. And that it's in our nature because of that choice. And so the purpose of the Old Testament is to talk about God's covenant. In fact, really literally, it's the old covenant. All right, it was the covenant that God had with His people, Israel, the Hebrew people. And we'll talk specifically about that. And I'm kind of throwing some things out there, but it's really hard to dive into it without just getting all the chips on the table and going for it. And as He makes this covenant with us, then we get another chance, a second chance, because obviously God had to rid the world of sin, and because everything that everyone did was always evil all the time. That's what the Bible says about people before the flood. He destroyed it, wiped it all out. And it wasn't just the people that suffered. And He started anew with Noah. And through his sons and progeny, then the world was made anew. And God created a nation, a people that came from that, and really more specifically a kingdom, and we'll talk about the kingdom books here in a little bit in the historical section. So when did this happen? I always like to know dates, and I want to suggest to you a great book. It's about that thick. It's not something you just sit down and read, but it's called The Annals of the World, and it's actually a biblical chronological history of all things. So if you're like me and you just can't stand that the Old Testament in particular is divided up by genre and you just need some chronology in your life, that is the book that you need. And it starts at the very beginning, and it dates things 10 to 12,000 BC and brings it all the way up, through not quite the modern age, but up to close to that. So this period that is happening here in the law is an important period because God is establishing right and wrong. I mean, that's really the purpose of the law, right? The law helps us understand what's right, what's good, what's wrong, what's bad. And, when I was a kid, there wasn't a lot of questions about that. I grew up in thinking that things were very black and white. This is right, this is wrong. Our culture hadn't really openly challenged that idea. I mean, there were hints of that. There were things in play that had set us on a course to get to that place. But it was nothing like now, where when you go and just poll the average American, the average person walking down the street, the idea that there is an absolute right and an absolute wrong is no longer a widely accepted view. People will say things like, well, this is right for me, but it might not be right for you. And so we've thrown out this idea, we as in the culture, has thrown out this idea that there is an absolute right and wrong. But in the Bible, there is an absolute right and wrong. And I hope that through this, perhaps I can persuade you, if you're not quite there, that it's important that we accept that view. Let's talk specifically about these 5 books that are in the law. We've talked about Genesis. Exodus literally means exit, all right, which you probably didn't have to think too hard to figure that out. It talks about how God delivered the Israelites who were in slavery in Egypt, how he delivered them. It's a story of Moses and is a great book. And incidentally, I'm going to refer to, there's a scholar by the name of Michael McGoodwin who has prepared some wonderful summative type information about the Old Testament. I'm going to try to reference and read some of that for you because I think some of the things in here are really interesting. Leviticus deals with the Levites, really, which were the priestly class. There were 12 tribes found in the nation of Israel, and they came from whom? Who can enlighten us? Yes? The brothers of Joseph. Good. So if you've seen the musical last year, Dan and Branson, or if you've ever seen the movie or read the story, then you know that it's quite a story, how Joseph is thrown out and rejected by his brothers, and he ends up a slave, but then God uses that his misfortune to deliver the people in Canaan and his family, and then a nation ensues from that, and it's quite an inspiring story. And we see a lot of the information there with that. And then in Leviticus, the Levites were the priestly class that were set apart to do the work of God in the tabernacle. And it's very tedious if you read Leviticus, because there's measurements for everything, and there's certain types of materials that have to be used. And so it's kind of a tough read. I know that there's a couple books that are really hard for me to get through in particular. Leviticus is one of them. Ezekiel's another one. Because you're just going through a lot of numbers. And so I try to take a step back sometimes and ask myself, why is that important? Why is that valuable information? And I think that it is. And we don't have enough time really to go into all of those things. But I think those things are kept for us to understand the significance of the law. And how hard it truly is to perfectly keep the law. I mean, we have kind of our watered-down sense of what's right and wrong in our culture. But in this time, when there are 200 and some odd, I can't remember how many Levitical laws, keeping those laws, it would be just almost an exercise in futility. I can't imagine how hard it would be to remember all of that, much less have the self-control and the patience to do those things. But yet, these are the things that God said to the Levites you need to do, and all kinds of sacrifices and such. Then Numbers is a fascinating book because it talks about the time that the Israelites wandered in the wilderness. And that's really because, long story short, they didn't have the faith to walk into the promised land that God had prepared for them. And so their penalty was to wander. And I think that's something that we can relate to very well in our lives, that there are often times that God sets in our path His plan. It's clear. He calls us to a mission. We stop short of fulfilling that, and God puts us and sends us through this time of character building. In fact, we even in the church, we kind of call it our wilderness time. And you might even say, when somebody asks, well, how are you? Well, I'm kind of in a wilderness period of my life. And if you're not, if you didn't grow up in church and somebody said that to you, and you're always wondering, well, what in the world are they talking about? And you know how we're like, oh yeah, we just go along with it, even though we're thinking, I have absolutely no idea what in the world you're saying. But that's where that is. So there you go. There's one more little inside thing that you can take with you. So Numbers deals with that time, also deals with Numbers and so specific things, a little bit like Leviticus and such, which then lands us in Deuteronomy, which literally means the copy of the law, or the commentary on the law, or the spelling out of the law. And then it goes in and takes really some of the earlier things, the Ten Commandments and Levitical laws, and kind of spells it out in kind of a here's how we should live type of way. So all those 5 books deal, though, specifically with the law and the stories, the narratives, the history that brings us to a place of understanding where we came from, how it all started, the problem that really is being dealt with, and it is fulfilled when Christ comes, because the whole reason He had to come is because we weren't able to meet that covenant. We weren't able to fulfill it on our own. And so God had to do something to fix that dilemma. And so, it's probably my favorite part of the Old Testament, just because there is a lot of history. It deals specifically with the problem of evil, why there's evil, why God gave us free will. All those things I think are dealt with and found there specifically. And if you want to understand what it really was like to be a Jew or to be a Hebrew at that time, and we're talking 2500 BC-ish, and then coming closer towards the birth of Christ, that's what it was like. All the animal sacrifices, the rituals, the places to go, the building of the altars, that's what it was like. To be a follower of God, that is what was required. And honestly and frankly, if Christ had not come, that's how we would be today. We would still be trying to keep all those laws and those rituals and those sin sacrifices. It would be a little messy in here. We probably wouldn't be able to have carpet. We'd probably have to have a concrete floor. You'd kind of be like Chris is getting ready to go out and turn his turkeys into meat here later today. It's not just a simple little process. It gets messy. It's gruesome. That sacrifice is almost something that's just outside of our normal experience. We just can't really even, we look at that and we go, that's just weird, that's just strange. We can't really imagine that. But for them, that was life. That was what it meant to be a part of that nation, to be a part of that people. Well, let's turn now and look at Joshua through Esther, which deals with the history of that nation. All right, so God's brought them out of slavery. They've gone through the wilderness. He's delivered them into the promised land. And there is a bloody campaign to take the promised land. And I think a lot of us, we have a hard time with this section in here because we like to take our cultural values and read them into the Scriptures. And so we don't really understand a lot of time the need for a lot of the things that happen. But I think there's an underlying premise that you have to always deal with when we read anything, especially in this series, and that's that God is on a mission to rid the world of sin, to rid the world of pain, suffering, death, evil, all of those things. That is the underlying premise. And everything that happens, everything, and I'm not just saying that generally, but literally everything that happens, every word that is written is the fulfillment of God dealing with that issue, dealing with that problem. That's why it comes up so quickly in Genesis, I believe. Because God sets out the problem that we face. The problem of sin, the problem of death, the problem of evil. It's right there, and it is always staring at us. It is always ever present in our life. It seems like we can't, or I can't go 30 minutes or an hour without somehow running into that problem. Either in my own selfish desires or in someone else who, steals from me or lies to me or, is selfish or whatever. So as we look at the history then of God's people, the whole idea is that God is ridding these areas where people worship, Baal and all these pagan gods and goddesses and all kind. There's just a plethora of different religions and things, and so God is wiping out that evil, that darkness, that sin, and He is replacing it with a nation of holiness. And that's why the law is dealt with in such a specific way, because God is very concerned with our holiness, with our righteousness, with our pursuit of good rather than the pursuit of evil. So what do we find? We look at the period of the judges, then we have kind of the period of the monarchies or the kings and queens, which came about really because the nation of Israel was just sick to death of judges, and they wanted to be like all these pagan nations that had kings and queens. And so God said, okay, I'm going to give you a king, and then there was Saul, and that was a disaster, and then there was a David, and he did some great things, also did some not so great things. Then there was Solomon, and so there are really three periods of history that come up here, and I was actually going to list those dates here. So probably from about 1370 until about 1050 BC. That's kind of the period of time. And those three phases are the period of the judges, then there's the Davidic period or kingship, and then there's the Solomonic or the period of King Solomon in there. And those are really how those are divided, and they're not necessarily in chronological order. But the history there is significant because we see a pattern of events that happens. Because Israel's conquered multiple times by different people, Babylonians, Assyrians, Persians, and at different times in that history, there's always one consistent thing, that God's people begin to fall away from Him. They begin to worship other gods and goddesses. They begin to be concerned with other things. And so when that happens, God warns them, all right? He sends prophets, and we'll talk more about that here when we talk about the major and minor prophets. But He sends a warning. He sends messengers to say, hey, you guys need to get back on track, or I'm going to let these other nations come and wipe you out. And then there are times where they repent and they turn back to God, and God spares them, and their nation is strengthened. And then there are times where they're just like, okay, whatever, we don't care, it'll all be good. Let's go and set up our Ashtoreth poles, and let's go worship the prophets of Baal. And then God says, okay, that's what you wanted. Bam, here comes the barbarian armies, wipe them out, take them off to be slaves. And actually, several of these stories, in particular Esther in Nehemiah, deals a lot with that. What was it like for the people to be hauled off and taken away, and what it's like when they come back. And so it's really a fascinating period of time. And really, I know that some of you guys have mentioned casually to me, I just kind of avoid the Old Testament. It doesn't seem that interesting, that applicable to me. But I want to try to persuade you that if you'll just take some time and make it a priority to go through and read the law, read these books of history, and understand and think about, put yourself in that world, what it was like to see a pillar of fire and to be delivered and to see the seas parted, only to abandon God and to turn away and to forget the things that He did. It's a great treatise on how we live our lives today. It's very applicable. It's very relevant because we do those same things. We do those same things. We have an experience with God, and we're excited. We're passionate about it. We sacrifice to serve Him. We get our priorities right. And then slowly the world and the enemy just kind of pulls us away, draws us away, and we get interested in other things and fascinated by other things. And pretty soon we've just moved to this place where we're not really even following God anymore. And then God, what does He do? He's patient with us. He's not out there just kind of waiting for us to mess up and go, ooh, he messed up, bam, Ooh, Thomas messed up, bam, Cassie messed up, bam, Jeff messed up, bam, He's not like that. He gives us a warning. He said, hey, you know what? You're in a place, you're in a bad place. Come back. And then we can choose to either heed that warning or ignore it, and the consequences ensue. We reap what we sow. And so that whole section of history there gives a narrative that describes how that's happened hundreds and thousands of years before we were even born. And you've probably heard the phrase, I can't remember who termed it first, that whoever ignores history is doomed to repeat it. And I found it to be amazingly true for us as Christians, that we ignore all the history of our people and we repeat the same mistakes that they made so many years ago. All right, let's move on to the books of prophecy. I hate skipping through so fast. There's so many things to say, but we would be doing this all year long, and maybe sometime we'll kind of go back and talk specifically about some of these sections and some of these books. But this is still kind of an experiment to see if we can handle this type of teaching. And hopefully, I see a couple snoozers, but not too many. So that's about normal. So I don't know if that's better or worse or not. All right, poetry. 5 books in this section. Now, I'll be completely honest with you. I'm not a poetry lover. I enjoy hearing it, especially if somebody I know writes it, then that is particularly interesting to me. And there are some works, there are some literary works that are fascinating to me. But I don't just, I have an afternoon off and I think to myself, oh, I think I'll just read some poetry. I don't know, it just doesn't occur to me. But I want to challenge you, if you feel a little bit like that this section isn't as much about poetry as it is wisdom literature. All right, we kind of we put it in the genre of poetry because it has rhyme apparently, and it sounds cool, and it's in a certain prose form. But really, what it is, it's sayings. It's it's like an apple a day keeps the doctor away kind of thing. It's a cliche. It's something we grow up hearing, but yet there's an important truth there, right? If we eat healthy, if we take care of ourselves, then we're less likely to become ill. All right, that's kind of the lesson in that statement. And so these books here, Job, Psalms, Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, Song of Solomon, they're all like that. Now, Job happens way back chronologically, like in the middle of Genesis. So it's many hundreds of years removed from Psalms, Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, and Song of Solomon, which all take place during the Davidic period and the Solomonic, I don't know, however you say that, period. So there are some differences there, and also with the book of Job, it's written very differently than really the rest of these, particularly Proverbs and Ecclesiastes. But there is the one thing that they all have in common is that there are phrases of wisdom that lie there. I mean, Proverbs specifically. There was a time in my life where I never wanted to hardly read the Bible unless I at least read one proverb, because they're so rich in truth. They're so practical. You can read just 1 or 2 proverbs, and immediately your eyes are just kind of open to a truth that sets us free from a life of defeat and a life of sin. Some of them are written by David, some of them are written by Psalms, particularly, as we look at Ecclesiastes, almost exclusively probably from Solomon, Song of Solomon. But they deal with the everyday things in life, and I think that's why it's so interesting, because we tend to be fascinated with the practical. And there are times, probably as the economy waxes and wanes, that probably is what deals with that. But there are times where we get a little more luxurious, and things are good, and money's good, and costs are down, and income's up, and we start thinking a little more luxuriously. But then something happens, money gets tight, the economy tanks, and we end up in that place where we become very practical, and we just want to know how to get it done. We don't care how pretty it is necessarily, but we want to learn and understand and know how to live efficiently and thrifty. And so these truths, this wisdom literature that's here, helps us grab a hold of those things, not only in a spiritual sense, but just in a very everyday sense. In fact, for many years, I don't know how long, probably the first 15 or 20 years I was a Christian, I always categorized everything. I would think to myself, well, this is a spiritual thing. This is an emotional thing. This is a physical thing. Everything had categories. And I didn't understand how really all intertwined they are. Our physical, it's just like with your health. Your physical health affects your emotional health, affects your spiritual health, and they're all woven together. And as God has kind of changed my heart, and He's grown me, He's helped me to see and understand truth and understand how life really is versus what my perception is. I mean, that's the whole idea of existentialism and the existential movement in philosophy, this idea that our experience is something different than reality. which is a great truth. I mean, that is certainly the case. We can believe something all day long and think it's right and true and good or bad or whatever, but that doesn't make it so. Things really are actually right and wrong or good or bad or whatever in spite of how we perceive them. And that's that whole idea of that. And these books of wisdom literature, these books of poetry, they deal specifically with those issues. They deal specifically with ideas of how things are and how they ought to be and how choices that we make impact our lives and the lives of people around us. And so when we read things like Psalms and we're dealing with worship and the character of God and who God is and how David cried out to God in these different times. And you can kind of, if you read the chronological, if you have a phone or a tablet and you go to the YouVersion app and you read the chronological Bible plan, it actually mixes in, and it's amazing. Somebody spent forever figuring this out. But it mixes in where all of the Proverbs and the Psalms, where they all go in the historical books. So like in 1 Kings and 2 Kings and Chronicles. And it's just a great way, because all of a sudden all these numberless Psalms, and I mean that with all respect, but just like Psalms 20 whatever, I don't even think there's a 2 ever, but Psalms 25 and 39, and it's like, wow, okay, what are these about? And then all of a sudden when you see them historically, and you see them in the context of what's happening historically in the nation of Israel, the nation of Judah, and the life of David, then they come alive, and all of a sudden it makes sense, and you understand the context of those things. Just like when we read about hymns or worship songs, the history, when they were written, why they were written, what was going on, what was happening. It becomes more interesting, and it kind of comes alive in our minds, and those books are very much like that. All right, let's move on and talk about, then all the remaining books are in 2 categories. There are major prophets and there are minor prophets. Now, I want to say something up front. Sometimes when we talk about major and minor prophets, we tend to think, well, the major prophets are the more important people and the minor prophets are the less important people. And that's not really the case. All of these people are important. They were all used by God at different places, different times. So it's not that some are more important than others, but some of them are obviously much larger. If you compare, for example, Isaiah to Habakkuk, Isaiah's 20 or 30 times longer. So there are some specific things that happen historically that are life and death, make it or break it moments for the nation of Israel and for Judah later when they became 2 kingdoms. And the major prophets deal specifically with those events. So let's talk about Isaiah, Jeremiah, Lamentations, which is just a really sad book, Ezekiel, Daniel, which some of these too, you could argue, if we really got into talking about this, and I have to be careful in a situation like this, because some of you guys, if it gets too intellectual, you're just going to be like, okay, and gone. But if it's too blah, too general, then it's kind of like, okay, well, I could have, just read that. So it's hard to find that middle balance there. But we could debate a little bit and talk about some of these books being like apocalyptic type books, talking about the end of the world, the first coming of Christ, second coming of Christ. And I think that's a good case that you could make. So if you're a little bit on the intellectual side and you're thinking about that and you're going, well, I don't know if I'd put Daniel, in there. But really, that's what a prophecy is generally. It's the forthtelling of the gospel, literally. The things not only that are to come in the future, but the work of God. What's it all about? It's fascinating to me. We are very interested with the things that are upon us right now in our life. If money's tight, it's just like everything that's on our minds. We're always thinking about that. If our job's in jeopardy, we're nervous about it. We're wondering what our boss is going to do or say next to us, and what, whatever issues they're just right there. But the funny thing about it is we experience these moments in time where something tragically horrible happens. A friend close to us dies. Someone that, our spouse or a friend or a son or daughter becomes really ill. And somehow our whole worldview, all the things that we take for granted, that gets shaken. Have you ever experienced a moment like that? How many people have experienced a moment like that? That all of a sudden, everything that just seemed normal and calm, thank you, it stops for a moment. It's almost like your life just gets paused. And there is what I call a moment of clarity. And even in the classical Renaissance period, they called it, an epiphany. It's this, all of a sudden things just kind of become clear. And all the petty things that we were concerned about, or at least comparatively petty, those are no longer of interest to us. And we're dealing with the situation of life and death. We're dealing with the situation that is so big that we quit worrying about all the vanity, all of the, and of course Solomon talks a lot about that in several of his books, how vain we really are and how meaningless so many things are in life, and that we give them so much attention and time and focus, and the things that really have value, we kind of settle them down, we put them on the back burner. We're not as concerned with those things. But these prophecies, particularly these major prophets, they deal with these life and death themes. These big things like whether or not your nation is going to be taken into captivity and you're going to be dragged off as a slave somewhere else. It'd be like if China, Russia, North Korea, I don't know, whomever comes over here and somehow miraculously takes us down, nukes us, and drags us all off to be slaves. I mean, all of a sudden, your job and, your pantry and your car and all those things, they just become meaningless, right? I mean, they just don't matter anymore because those things are gone. And so I think these books, one of the things that they do for us as Christians is they help us recognize and maybe sort out what's really important in life and what's not particularly important in life. And I think it's easy for us if we just kind of skippity-doo-dah through life and we're not really thinking about right, wrong, God, the devil, and we're just kind of doing our thing, we get way off track, way out of balance. We forget completely about the things that matter, that are important, the people that are in our lives. I mean, I tell you what, if you're a parent in this room and your child's life has ever been threatened, it is amazing how quickly we get an attitude adjustment, isn't it? It's amazing. All of a sudden, God has our attention, we're focused, we're praying, we're seeking God. I mean, it is amazing how in that instant, God, He grabs us just like that. Or that circumstance that God allows grabs us just like that. Because I don't believe that God just causes every terrible thing to happen. Sometimes there's sin and death, and we experience the consequences of that naturally. So in these major prophets, specifically, Isaiah and Jeremiah in particular, God sends them to come to Israel, to come to Judah and say, you guys have lost perspective. You've gotten completely off track. And if you continue this path of events, you will be destroyed. Your life, as you know it, will end. And the funny thing is that there's really not a big difference between what happened here historically and those moments in our lives. When the pause button gets pushed and we kind of have, I call it kind of a come to Jesus moment. I say that a little flippantly, and I shouldn't mean it flippantly. But in other words, all of a sudden we stop being petty, we stop being selfish, and we begin to think about what's really, truly, actually important. Going to Ukraine for the first time several years ago now, back in 2009, was an eye-opening, life-changing thing for me, as I've shared with many of you guys. And not only because it was so different and the hardships that they endure versus us are certainly tremendous, but more importantly than that, there are groups of Christians there that live so authentically and they live so faithfully to the calling of God. I'll be honest with you, it almost makes our churches here in America seem like we're just a bunch of pagan non-Christians. I'll be completely honest, and I don't mean any offense or meanness by that statement, but because the contrast of how they live their lives and how focused they are on the things that really matter, that are really important, and the contrast with that and how we many times live, or at least I'll not put this on you guys, I'll put this on me, the way that I live my life, it is amazing how different it is. And I ask myself, and I've just repeatedly have just begged God to say, God, show me what's the difference. Why is it so hard for us here? Why do our churches struggle to be impactful, and why are we in a decline as a nation? I mean, why? And the only answer that I can seem to get from the Lord is it's because we have so many things to distract us, so much riches and wealth and food and everything else that we take it all for granted and we just forget God. We're just like Israel and Judah. We have forsaken God. We've forsaken our first love, which is the warning in the New Testament, which we'll talk about maybe next week. And we're just kind of on this path of destruction. But yet God has warned us. He's set about and He's put before us men and women that have come before us many, many years, the struggles that they had, the choices that they've made for good and for bad. I mean, look at David, look at Jonah. It's not like everything in the Bible is always good. In fact, probably, I don't know, but it seems to me like most of the time we're making a bunch of bad choices and experiencing the consequences of those choices, and God's Word is there to help us understand the danger. Just like a good parent keeps their child from, putting their finger on the stove or, getting themselves locked in the dishwasher or the washing machine, so they don't drown or whatever. I was amazed to find out actually today, that's why this is on my mind, that on our dishwasher there's actually a lock where you can, keep it from the buttons working or starting it. And I looked at that and I was like, why on earth? Now keep in mind, my children are kind of grown up now, and so we don't have, a lot of the little ones that are toddler age. But I was like, why in the world? I get the washer and dryer, but why on the dishwasher? How could a child really even get it? But as I got to looking at it, thinking about it, I was like, yeah, okay, some child could probably crawl in there, and big brother and big sister comes along and starts pushing the buttons, and, see you later, and then, and pretty soon, that ends badly. So I guess I understand that. But all of those things are there as a protection for us, right? To keep us safe, to keep us from harm. And so that's how God is. He's like a good father. He's created this world. He's made it clear. These things are profitable. These things are good. You will be blessed by these things. You will experience a life of generally peace, even though there's going to be hard times, there's going to be problems, there's going to be other people's sin that affects us. But if we'll just focus on living this way, good things will come. But if we reject that and we walk away from God and we dive into all these things in the world and we let it corrupt us and we let it take our sin nature and wreck us, then we're going to experience the pain and suffering that comes from the consequences of those choices. And it's all right here. It's all right here. This past week, and I know we're out of time, I'm going to wrap it up here in just a second. And we'll pick it up next week with the minor prophets. One of the things that's before me, and I've talked with several of you about this, trying to learn from all of your wisdom about fence building. I need to put a nice entrance in at the front of our farm. I cut out a section of barbed wire, and we kind of abandoned the old gate because it's just really a little corral entrance, and want to try to make an entrance. So if we have church events or things, people can pull in if you don't have four-wheel drive, and just kind of have a nice fence. Well, I've learned a lot of interesting things. First of all, I've learned that there are literally 100 different ways to build a fence, which I had no idea. I always kind of thought, well, a fence is a fence. But a fence is not just a fence, all right? There are options. There's wood and all kinds of metal and all kinds of barbed wire and all kinds of, should you use cedar or treated pine? The list is a very complicated thing. And I found myself kind of trying to reinvent the wheel, forget that for hundreds, for thousands of years, because people used to build stone fences and wood fences forever ago, people have mastered the art of building the fence, right? The right way and the wrong way. And let me tell you, there are very few right ways to build a fence and a million wrong ways to build a fence. But I spent a lot of time just trying to reinvent the wheel, trying to come up with a better way or some creative way, to dodge the expense, mostly, of building a good, solid fence that will look decent, but also, most importantly, keep the cows from exiting the farm, which is kind of the purpose for a fence. And as I've thought about this whole struggle, I've thought that it's a lot like living the Christian life. We're always trying to reinvent the wheel, to kind of cheat God a little bit. It's like, well, I love my sin, I love all these evil things, so I want to try to do them, but I also want to be a Christian because I know that's the right thing, and I want to follow Christ because I know that's the right thing, and I certainly don't want to burn forever. And we come up with all these things, so we just try to kind of grab both of these things. And the truth is that God has given us something priceless, something that will help us not be in the place where we're trying to reinvent all that, trying to figure life out, trying to figure out what's right, what's wrong, whether to turn to the left, to turn to the right. But He's given us, and we have to work for it, because it's not a manual necessarily, where you read it from beginning to end and it all makes sense and it's easy and it's like, okay, do this, this, and this. But He's given us the opportunity that if we will seek Him, if we will seek that righteousness, I think Annette needs some sound. Guys, she's got that look like, hey, it's not working right. If we will seek after it, I mean, what does the Bible say? Seek after the kingdom of God. But if we will knock, if we will search for that wisdom that is found there, that we will find it. It may seem a little bit hidden, a little bit shrouded. We may have to learn about some different languages, some different cultures. We may have to not want it to be just easy, because a lot of times you don't want to take the time to read things. You want to pick up the phone, call somebody, watch a YouTube video. We don't want to work for it. But I don't think this is a situation like that. I think this is a situation where we have to work for it. We have to want it and own it. And so as we kind of close this section, talking about the significance of the Old Covenant, of the Old Testament, I want to invite you to maybe let go of some of the prejudice that you've had towards that, and maybe some of the laziness. For me, I think it's probably laziness. I didn't want to go to all that work to understand it. I didn't think it was important. I thought, well, I'll just come to church. Somebody will preach about it or tell me what I need to know, what I need to learn. But yet God says that we are to seek after Him, to know Him, to understand Him. And that in fact, in Genesis it says we're created in His image, in His likeness. And so there is a part of us that is like God. And to know and to understand that part is to know and understand who He is. Let's pray. God, thank You for today. Thank You for Your word that gives us such a rich blessing of knowledge, of history, of the law, of practical guide to living our lives. And God, I pray that You would just give us a desire to make it a priority in our lives, to immerse ourselves in it so that we would not sin in our arrogance, so that we would be people that are following after You. God, I just pray for every hurt, every need, every problem that's here today. I know, Lord, that sometimes we feel like we're alone. We feel like no one else is going through what we're going through and that nobody can understand. And God, first, I thank You for the people that they made the decision to get themselves here today, just to come and to worship and to experience that fellowship, to experience the ironing, sharpening of iron. And God, I pray that we would be strengthened as we leave today, that our children would be strengthened as they study Your word back in the classroom, in the back hallway. God, I pray that we would live out this thing, this word, this logos, this living, breathing truth of reality of all life this week wherever we go. In Jesus' name.